Good evening and welcome. My name is Ron Friedman, President of the Jewish Federation. We have a special program, a special treat tonight. I also want to make sure we thank the annual campaign of the Jewish Federation and also the Salem Foundation for helping sponsor with tonight's program. Our speaker tonight is Alan Dowty, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He's a graduate of Shimer College and the University of Chicago, where he received his PhD in 1963. From 1963 to 1975, he was on the faculty of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, during which time he was chair of the Department of International Relations and also served in the Israeli Army. Since 1975, he's been based at the University of Notre Dame, past president of the Association for Israel Studies, the only international academic association dedicated to the study of modern Israel. He's published widely, lectured in over 30 countries on the Arab-Israeli conflict, Israel politics, and U.S. foreign policy. His books are basic texts on Israeli society and politics, such as The Jewish State a Century Later, and also on the Arab-Israel conflict, such as Israel, Palestine, published in 2017. Among his other publications is the first academic study of Israel's nuclear weapons policy, which was published in 1972. And just last year, he received the annual Lifetime Achievement Award in Israel Studies from the Association for Israel Studies and the Israel Institute. His program tonight is entitled Israelis and the Palestinians, Has the Gap Narrowed? Let's welcome Professor Alan Dowty.
Thank you. That was more generous than I deserved. It's an honor to be back here. I was here 4 years ago, and I was invited back anyway. So that's always nice. I actually have some local roots here. My father grew up in North Manchester. It's been a long time since I've been there, but just thought I'd mention that. Sometimes it's worthwhile to ask simple-minded questions. For example, has the gap between Israelis and Palestinians narrowed over time, or has it gotten wider? Now, it seems like there ought to be an obvious answer to that question, but I'll bet if I took a poll here, I'd find people pretty much divided. Even the experts don't agree on this. And I would suggest that for a simple-minded question, we take a simple-minded search for an answer. Look at history. Let's just try to trace this over time. This reminds us of the importance of perspective, seeing things over the course of time. Sometimes that's the only way in which we can remain hopeful, or even remain sane. But first we have to get rid of some of the persistent myths that one hears about this. This is not an age-old conflict. It begins with Jewish settlement in historic Palestine about 135 years ago. Before then, Jews generally dwelt peacefully, if not as equals, in Arab lands. This is not a conflict caused by ethnic hatreds. There's been a lot of mutual hostility that's grown immensely over the course of the conflict, but I would argue more as a result than a cause. Again, Jewish minorities generally fared better in Arab or Muslim lands than they did in Europe. I don't think I have to elaborate on that one. This is not a conflict that's rooted in religious differences. Religious issues have emerged, but Judaism and Islam recognize each other as legitimate monotheistic faiths. So what is it about? At its core, it was and is a fight between two peoples over one land. This was put very, very succinctly by Israel's founding prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, who said, "We and they want the same thing. We both want Palestine." Conflict has been marked by 4 distinct stages, at least in my interpretation, with the 4th stage emerging since the turn of the last century. The first stage, which takes us down to 1948, this was a collision between the 2 communities in Palestine over land and over political control. What you see in the photo here, and you probably don't see it very clearly, Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, in 1898, his only visit to Palestine is at El Arish, looking at that as a possible location for a Jewish state. Do you know where El Arish is? It's in Sinai. That didn't work out. Second stage, with the founding of the State of Israel from 1948 to the late 80s, it's an interstate conflict between the new State of Israel and its neighboring Arab states. The Palestinians are temporarily eclipsed as an actor, a major independent actor in any event, in this. And here you have the Declaration of the State of Israel with David Ben-Gurion reading the Declaration of Independence. Third stage has roots in the 1960s, but really emerges only with the first Intifada in the late 1980s, marking the reemergence of the Palestinians as the major actor opposite Israel. And what we still call it the Arab-Israel conflict, right? And this is more a mark of the second stage than the third. Generally nowadays it's being referred to as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm sure you all recall this gentleman, right? Mr. Arafat, who symbolized the reemergence of the Palestinians. And then the 4th stage, the last decade, or a little bit more, the beginning of the second Intifada, perhaps in the year 2000, the collapse of the Oslo peace process, marked by radical religious forces which were opposed to a negotiated solution, and new actors, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, which is that totally peripheral to this previously. In the photo here is a Hamas training camp for young boys in the Gaza Strip. Now, in the beginning, going back to the 1880s, part of the Ottoman Empire, the southern part of what is now Israel, was an independent district governed directly from Constantinople. The northern half of what is now Israel were 2 districts that were part of the province of Beirut. There was no unit labeled Palestine. The Turks were afraid to do that because it would arouse too much religious interest from the Western world, not just Jews, but Christians as well. Now here's something that you really need to think about. You had the widest possible gap at the beginning because neither side even recognized that there was another side. How much wider a gap can you have? There was not, in the view of either side, another people here with collective rights or claims to this area. The Arabs and the Turks regarded Jews as a religion, not as a people, as a religion only. And they saw the new Jewish settlers coming in from Russia primarily as European colonialist intruders. Those settlers, for their part, saw the Arabs as individuals who would benefit from Jewish settlement, but not as a people with a collective identity. In all fairness, this is before the rise of Arab nationalism, and it was possible to say that there was no Arab national movement, therefore no Arab people that had to be considered in political terms. Nevertheless, even without nationalism, it's possible for people to oppose others that they see as strangers. And the Arabs did oppose Jewish settlement in Palestine from the outset. I have a book coming out on this in a few months if you're interested. One small example, in 1891, which was only a few years into this, 500 Arab notables in Jerusalem sent a telegram to Constantinople, to the Sultan, urging him to stop all Jewish immigration into Palestine. And the Turkish government, the Ottoman government, agreed. Officially, from that point on, almost all the Jews who came into Palestine were doing it in defiance of the official policy. And the opposition of the native population and of the Turkish authorities was not based so much on these settlers being Jewish. It was based on the fact that they were European. They were part of this big threat that the Turks had been facing for a century of penetration of European influence into their heartland. Then finally, we do get the appearance of Arab nationalism. It's usually dated to 1905. Why 1905? Because we have the first book coming out that declares the program for Arab nationalism by one Najib Azuri, who was a Lebanese Christian who had worked for the Ottomans in Palestine. And what he wrote was that there are two important phenomena here evident at the moment: the awakening of the Arab nation and the veiled effort of the Jews to reconstitute on a very large scale the ancient monarchy of Israel. These two movements are destined to fight continually until one vanquishes the other. That's 1905. Now, here you at least have recognition that there is another side. There are no concessions being made to that other side. It's going to be a fight to the bitter finish, a battle for supremacy, but at least there's recognition that there is another side. Same thing happens on the Jewish side in the same year. 1905, at least in my research, the first time you had a very serious, explicit recognition by a Jewish leader that, hey folks, we got a problem here, right? This was, in fact, a settler named Yitzhak Epstein, who came to Rosh Pinah, one of the very first settlements, and read a speech at the Zionist Congress in 1905, saying that we do have a problem here. As he says, we pay close attention to all the affairs of our land, we discuss and debate everything, but forget one small detail. There is in our beloved land an entire people that have been attached to it for hundreds of years. So he's calling for an explicit recognition of the existence of another party. And in the speech, he calls for forming a partnership with the native Arab population. But Epstein was practically a lone voice at that point. Most of these settlers and those in the Zionist movement, which existed by this time, believed that the success of the Zionist movement in itself would solve the problem, and Arabs would benefit from the development that they brought to that area. Now here you have, I have to move fast here, we've got 135 years to cover. Palestine after World War I. Forget the colors for the moment, just look at the borders here. Those are the borders set by the British in 1921. They have become the standard reference for what is Palestine and what is not. Kind of arbitrary, but there you are. Now, the British were given conflicting guidelines. The Balfour Declaration for a Jewish national home was written into the mandate given to the British. So they were supposed to work for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. Not necessarily all of Palestine, but part of it. At the same time, they are obligated to prepare the native population for self-government. And remember, the population of Palestine is still 90% Arab at this point. Well, the Arabs fight to keep their majority status. The Jews fight to become the majority, It's clear pretty much in everybody's mind that this is a fight for total control. Again, you see the other side, but there's no inclination at this point to make concessions based on the existence of another party to the conflict. It was only towards the end of the mandate, 1937, that the Jewish leadership, over much opposition and with many reservations, accepted the idea of partition, that is, of dividing Palestine into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. And here is what the British Commission, Appeal Commission of 37 proposed. The purple part would be a Jewish state. It's about 20% of Palestine. Most of the rest would become an Arab state. Jerusalem and the corridor would be internationalized. Proposal for 1937, accepted by the Jewish leadership, not by all of the community, but by the Jewish leadership. And this marks the first acceptance of a two-state model for resolving this conflict. So you've narrowed the gap considerably here. You have at least one side that has accepted a compromise solution. The Arabs rejected the 1937 proposal on grounds that Palestine was an integral part of the Arab world, that there was an Arab majority, still an Arab majority in the country entitled to self-determination, and once again that Jews are not a nation. Jews are just a religion, therefore they have no political rights as a group. 10 years later, they gave the same response to the UN partition plan, adopted by the General Assembly in 1947. The most that the Arab side was willing to concede in 47, when the UN debated, was to give Jews some autonomy within an Arab state. Now, that's a small step forward. It is a step forward, but it's a very small step forward. It's the first acceptance on the Arab side of any kind of status for Jews as a people within this framework. Nevertheless, since they did not accept the partition, and since Israel went ahead and declared its statehood, the outcome was, of course, the 1948-49 war. As a consequence of this war, Israel gains more of Palestine than it would have had under the partition plan. The partition plan would have given Israel about 45, I think 46% of Palestine. As the war, actually no, it's 56%, sorry. At the end of the war, Israel actually occupied 78% of Palestine. These are the 1949 armistice lines, referred to sometimes as the pre-67 borders. Officially, they weren't borders, they were just armistice lines, but it essentially set up the state of Israel within 78% of Palestine. And the other 22% was divided between the West Bank, held by Jordan. Transjordan annexed it and became Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, which was occupied by Egypt. You have a de facto partition here, but it's not a two-state solution. There is no Palestinian state. The parts of Arab Palestine are held by Jordan and Egypt. Conflict is now in this, what I call the second stage. This is interstate conflict. The Arab states cut off all contact with the new state of Israel. Boycott. The Arab governments have no incentive to accept the results of the war, so they are preparing for a second round. It's a tragedy for the Palestinians. The Palestinian community is devastated, its leadership scattered. Half of them become refugees, and their representatives tend to be the extreme rejectionists. The Palestinian political organization, to the extent that it survives, is centered in the refugee camps, where you have the most extreme rejection of the state of Israel. The Arab states, of course, support the Palestinians, but they have their own interests that do not include Palestinian independence. Not a single one of the Arab states really works for that. So the Palestinians for the next 20 years, as I've said, really are kind of eclipsed. There is no Arab state. The two-state solution is not really on the table anymore. Israel would have accepted peace on the basis of the status quo. After all, now 78% of Palestine occupied by Israel. Much better than anybody would have dreamed possible only 10 or 15 years before this. But there's no partner. There is no Arab state willing to make peace. The gap remains as wide or wider than before. The Arabs still refuse to accept the idea of a Jewish state, and Israel is relieved of the need to consider a Palestinian state. So there's a retreat from this two-state model. I was interested to see who was the first significant Arab leader who ever said maybe we should learn to live with Israel. And as far as I can determine, it was in 1965. If anybody remembers Bourguiba from Tunisia, which is a long way away, but nevertheless, he's apparently the first Arab leader who said this out loud and was thoroughly excoriated for it, of course. We now come to the second stage, which is tied to changes on the global scene, the rise of the third world. You recognize the gentleman in the photo, I'm sure. It's always a pleasure to speak to a mature audience with a little bit of historical memory. Mr. Nasser here. But you remember that this was part of a general development throughout the Arab world. Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, Sudan, Libya, Algeria all had military coups bringing to power Arab nationalists, socialists, usually aligned with the Soviet Union regimes. And this was led by Nasser, and the talk was on reversing the results of the 1948 war, talk of the second round. This quote that I give you here from Nasser, "We demand vengeance and vengeance," that's typical for the period. If you think extreme things are being said today, you need to go back and check the rhetoric from some of these previous periods. Obviously, the gap remains very wide due to the Arab rejection of the very idea of a Jewish state. 1967, I'm sure you all remember. Enthusiasm sweeps the Arab world. Nasser himself is carried away and claims that all of this was planned in advance. That this crisis that he had created was intentional. Evidence is it wasn't, but nevertheless, on the eve of the war, he says, we decided we could triumph, decided to take steps. Our basic objective will be to destroy Israel. Not much ambiguity on this. They had had 10 years of a military buildup with Soviet arms supply. They were apparently unified, whereas in 1948 and 1956, there had been no Arab unity. And Israel is isolated, whereas in 1956, Israel had had the support of Britain and France. This is one of the cartoons that appeared in the Arab press at the time. Each tank has the name of a different Arab country on it, and the anti-Semitic trope here in the middle represents Israel. Now, the consequences of 67, of course, is that Israel now occupies not only all of Palestine, that is the West Bank and Gaza, as well as the 78% it already held, but also parts of Arab states, the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. Of course, the West Bank had been a part of Jordan. So there's a basis for negotiation now that didn't exist before. Land for peace. Israel has something to bargain with for the first time, with the Arab states. This is embodied in UN Resolution 242, which hardly mentions the Palestinians except as a refugee problem. And Israel offered immediately to Egypt and Syria, not to Jordan, but to Egypt and Syria, to give them their land back in return for a peace treaty. But they weren't ready for that. Instead, we got the 3 no's of Khartoum, Arab conference held late in 67, which declared no peace, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Now, the fact is that there was a small step taken here by the Arab countries. They indicated willingness to reach a state of non-belligerency with Israel if they got their territories back. All of this, they hoped, without formal negotiations or a formal peace treaty. But they tried to indicate the three no's of Khartoum did not eliminate the possibility for some sort of arrangement. Going to a formal peace treaty and formal negotiations was still too big a step in their eye. But we now look in retrospect and see this as the beginning of an important development. This is the beginning of the disentanglement or disengagement of the Arab states, which leads to a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979 and a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan in 1994. This is no small development. This is 80% of Israel's land frontiers. And these peace treaties have held. The Egypt-Israel peace treaty is now held for 39 years. It's an important building block in the region. So this does mean a real change in the strategic picture. I would call your attention to the fact that there's not been a full-scale conventional war in the Middle East involving Israel since 1973. Without Egypt, the Arab countries really do not have a military option. So now we come to the third stage, the PLO. The Palestinians realized that the Arab states cannot deliver for them, that they they'll have to begin to act on their own. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, was founded in 1964, just before this war, but it grows really after that. This is a young Yasser Arafat together with Nasser here. And as I've said, the base of the PLO at the time was in the refugee camps of Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, which fosters a totally rejectionist view toward Israel. In the charter that they adopt in 1968, the main aim remains the complete destruction of Israel. Armed struggle is the only way. The Arab Palestinian people reject all solutions which substitute for the total liberation of Palestine. So you might ask, in this frame of what are they offering to Israel? Well, according to the same charter, the Jews who had normally resided in Palestine until the beginning of the Zionist invasion could stay. They'll be considered Palestinians. Interesting question then comes up. When is the beginning of the Zionist invasion? Palestinians have given different answers to this at different times. You could say 1882, when in fact the immigration started. You could say Balfour, 1917. You could say the creation of Israel, 1948. And different interpretations been given at different times. None of these, needless to say, something that any government of Israel would consider as a basis for negotiation. The full reemergence of Palestinians as a central player here is marked by the outbreak of the Intifada in late 1987. Low-level violence, protests, and so on. And the PLO is facing a fact here of life too, that its military options one by one have been closed off. At the same time, the Soviet Union, its main source of support, is falling apart. At the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union collapses. They're facing increasing pressure from the Arab states who want this conflict moderated. And the Intifada means a passage of power from the rejectionists in the refugee camps to those Palestinians actually living under Israeli occupation, who are the ones who are carrying out the Intifada, who are carrying the brunt of the struggle from their point of view. So the insiders gain more power within the PLO and other Palestinian organizations. All of this background, in 1988, the PLO accepts Resolution 242. Big change in their official policy at least. And in 1992, to the beginning of secret talks between the PLO and Israel, something that just a few years before this would have been totally inconceivable. So in September 1993, and I'm sure you all remember this, I took a television set into the classroom so we could watch the famous handshake on the White House lawn, mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO. I love this. There's Clinton just beaming together as he brings them closer together. Arafat, good role player, beaming also. And Rabin looks like he swallowed a frog. Pretty much body language tells you a lot about this. But nevertheless, this is a watershed change. First, mutual recognition between recognized mainstream leadership on the two sides. And the first agreed framework, it's only a framework, but still the first agreed framework for resolving the conflict. And returns us to the two-state model, which had first been talked about in the 1930s. And this is the first time that the Palestinians have been willing to work within the framework of a two-state solution. For Israel, it's also a big step. Israel, up to this point, had preferred to deal with the Arab states, since they found the Palestinians so uncompromising, and the Arab states, like Egypt and Jordan, turned out to be people you could talk to. But at the same time, undeniably, there's a great strategic advantage in reducing your enemies to the core. As there's a strategic phrase for this, economy of enemies. If you can peel off the Arab states from the opposition and deal just with the Palestinians, strategically there's a great advantage. The Palestinians by themselves are not a threat to the existence of Israel in the same way that the Arab world of 200 million people could conceivably be. No question about it, this is the biggest narrowing of the gap so far in the history of the conflict. We have, over the next 8 years, a peace process, further agreements, the election of a Palestinian Authority, the PA, which controls 40% of the West Bank territory, but 98% of the Palestinians who live there. The question that can legitimately be asked, though, is the PLO really given up its ultimate goal of destroying Israel? Remember that charter? Well, the Israeli government did think to ask about that. And as part of the initial bargaining, Arafat said, well, those parts of the charter that talked about destroying Israel no longer valid. Forget about it. Well, the Israeli government points out that there is a provision in that charter for revising it. So if this is no longer valid, how about changing your charter? Well, they convened the Palestine National Council and they announced that all those articles in the charter that called for destroying Israel are no longer valid. But they didn't specify which articles they were talking about. So the Israeli government again says, why don't you do this the right way? And finally, in 1998, in the presence of the American president, Bill Clinton, Palestine National Council did revise its charter specifying which articles were revoked in that charter. And that satisfied even the Netanyahu government of the time, the Israeli government at the moment. This culminates in the first ever attempts to negotiate the basic issues of the conflict, which took place in 2000-2001, first at Camp David and then at Taba. And I'll come back to that in a moment. As you may recall, however, this was immediately followed by the collapse of the whole peace process. We have the rise of Hamas as a result of the Intifada. We have the Hezbollah movement in Lebanon, which is not Palestinian, but nevertheless sees Israel as one of its main enemies. And the Hamas, Hezbollah, well, one's Shia and the other Sunni. Nevertheless, they share a worldview of Islamic extremists. The eventual victory is assured. They are on the winning side in history. Time is on their side. And the Jews are responsible for most of the world's evils. The 2 world wars, both caused by Jews. Communism and capitalism, both caused by Jews. This is in the Hamas covenant. I've had occasion to pull out a copy in Arabic and show it to Palestinians who didn't believe me. He even covers the protocols of the elders of Zion, which appears in the Hamas covenant, believe it or not. I have a quote here in my book about one of the leaders of Hamas saying, "The conflict with Israel is not a matter of land." Now, for over a century, it's been primarily a conflict over land. But he says, no, it's a conflict over ideology. It's the very existence of Judaism that bothers him. Therefore, it's no surprise that in this worldview, there's no room for a Jewish state. There's no room for peace with Israel. And the Charter says, this is the initials for Hamas stand for Islamic Resistance Movement. The land of Palestine is an Islamic waqf, which means trust, consecrated for future Muslim generations until Judgment Day. It or any part of it should not be squandered. It or any part of it should not be given up. And in the photo is the founder of Hamas, Ahmed Yassin, who happens to be a paraplegic. That was from a childhood accident, not from combat. So we have a turning point here, at least as I see it, in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century. The conflict seems to me to enter a new stage with new actors. In January 2006, Hamas wins a legitimate election in the Palestinian territories, wins a majority of the seats in the Palestinian legislature under a system designed by Fatah, by Arafat's followers, to favor them. But they lost anyway. Now, President Abbas, who was elected in a different term, was supposed to stand for re-election in 2009. They hadn't gotten around to holding a new election for the president yet. So Abbas remains president, and Hamas, nevertheless, still holds, in theory, a majority in the legislature. No question here that we've widened the gap again. Not to where it used to be, but nevertheless, as opposed to where it reached in the 1990s, we've enlarged it again. We have new parties to the conflict that do not accept the basic framework for settlement. And it's unlikely that any Israeli government, no matter how dovish, is going to make significant concessions so long as Hamas controls Gaza. And that's been true since 2007, when Hamas unilaterally seized control of the Gaza Strip, and that remains divided. PA controls the West Bank, Gaza still rules Hamas still rules in Gaza. Now, during this period, there was in Israel a brief flowering of a theory of disengagement. If Israel cannot negotiate a solution, then let's just decide where the borders should be and withdraw to them and unilaterally resolve this. Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon in 2000. Israel, under Ariel Sharon, Superhawk, withdrew from Gaza Strip in 2005. But Hezbollah soon took over in southern Lebanon and made it a base for operations against Israel. And Hamas, of course, has launched numerous rocket attacks from Gaza after 2007. So it's no great surprise that in Israel, support for unilateral disengagement has evaporated. It obviously, in the viewpoint of most Israelis, has not worked. And we've had those recurring wars, particularly with the Gaza Strip, 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014. And Israeli politics has turned very significantly to the right in direction. Now, it's not clear how long this fourth state will last or what will come next. I do want to briefly mention some of the other forces at work which are opposed in part to the trends that I've described. First, Oslo does leave some positive legacies. It was the first mutual recognition between the two sides. The first Palestinian self-governance on its own soil, even though very limited. The second peace treaty, the Jordan peace treaty, came about as a result of this. There's ongoing interactions and contacts on all levels now between Palestinians and Israelis, particularly between the Israeli government and the PA. That never existed before. And we had the first serious negotiations over the basic issues of the conflict, Camp David and Tom. So in my mind, Oslo deserves better than to be considered the worst four-letter word in Middle East diplomacy. The gap is still far narrower than it was before Oslo. Secondly, there's been a change in the strategic orientation of several important Arab countries. You've sensed this if you follow the news at all. The threat of radical Islam has alarmed countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Gulf states. There's a lot of cooperation going on there, but underneath the surface. That you don't. Egypt and Israel today are practically strategic allies. And this changes the context quite a bit. These countries, within the last month, we've had public statements made by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and by an important minister of the UAE saying it's time to recognize Israel. Public statements made that wouldn't have been made just a few years ago. Third, there is still strong support for a two-state solution on both sides. I should point out that Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2009 made his Bar Ilan speech in which he came out in support of a two-state solution. That is still the official policy of the Israeli government. You could ask what he's done to realize it, but nevertheless that remains the official position. Very conditional, very much circumscribed, but nevertheless only some of the far-right parties in Israel are still opposed in principle to a two-state solution. Public opinion has declined in support, but it's still a majority. I just got this figure today. Still, as of December, 55% of Israelis support the two-state solution, 52% of Palestinians. Experience shows here that if, in fact, a two-state solution suddenly was on the agenda again, that this support would go up significantly. Because at one time it was 70% on both sides. I want to take a quick look at the three major attempts to reach a resolution here, beginning with Camp David and Taba in 2000-2001. Again, these were the first serious face-to-face talks by accredited leaders of the two sides in the 120 years of the conflict. So maybe expectations should be tempered in light of that. Camp David in July of 2000 was a failure with many fathers. There was a cottage industry developed over who was to blame here. Doesn't much matter. In December of that year, Clinton, his last month in office, enunciated what he thought should be the guidelines, we call them parameters, for a settlement. They were accepted in theory by both sides. Negotiations were held in January 2001 at Taba, the Egyptian resort. And the framework was two states. Hey folks, for the last 30 years, the only model that has been seriously negotiated has been the two-state model. Two states based on the pre-67 armistice lines with land swaps. bring Israeli settlements into Israel by drawing a line around them and then compensating the Palestinians with empty land elsewhere. That's the prevailing idea at the moment. Demilitarized Palestinian state, Jerusalem divided basically along Arab-Jewish lines, but to remain an open city and a capital of both countries. And then talks on this basis were held at Taba. What remained unresolved? The size of the land swap. Israel wanted to annex 6% of the West Bank, but to give 3%, equivalent of 3% to the Palestinians in exchange. Palestinians insisted on a 3-for-3, equal areas. So they were only apart by 3% at this point. On Jerusalem, there was, of course, a serious argument about control of the Temple Mount. That's inevitable. That's one of the most difficult issues. This is the third holiest site of Islam. Maybe the most important for Jews, but it's also the third holiest in Islam. Is it possible to negotiate some kind of Jewish access? Even the most hawkish Israeli government has not tried to interfere with Muslim control of that site. You want to incite the whole Muslim world against you? It's not in the cards. Not in the cards at all. But would it be possible to negotiate some kind of Jewish access so that Jews could pray there? That remains to be seen. And the other issue, of course, refugees. The Palestinian refugees from 1948-49, now primarily their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, number over 5 million today. They insist on the absolute right of return. That has not changed. In my mind, that remains the single biggest obstacle to a solution. No Israeli government is going to admit more than a token number of that 5 million. Now, why did Taba fail? Well, there were these unresolved issues, but they also ran out of time. Israel was holding an election. Ehud Barak and Ariel Sharon were squaring off. Israel very briefly had a separate election for prime minister. And Ariel Sharon won by an overwhelming majority. And that ended this particular chapter of diplomacy. Plus, the Intifada was renewed. Plus, there were continuing new Jewish settlements that riled up the Palestinians. And there were demonstrations in the refugee camps. The Palestinian refugees felt they were being sold out. Nobody had told them they weren't going back to where their grandparents lived. And Abbas, 2007, 2008, Olmert had succeeded Sharon when Sharon had his stroke. They founded the centrist party Kadima because Likud was not going along with the negotiation. Arafat had died by this time, replaced by Abbas. When the two got together following the Annapolis Conference of 2007, they worked from the same framework as Taba, basically. There was an interesting new idea. Anybody here heard of the Holy Basin before? It was a short-lived idea, I guess. The idea is that the old city of Jerusalem and the surrounding religious sites like the Mount of Olives and the original city of David would become an internationalized site governed by 5 supervising powers, 3 of whom would be Muslim. Interesting idea. They're still far apart on the refugees. But Olmert claimed, and he just published his memoirs, he got out of prison. They talked about building a new branch of the Illinois State Penitentiary for former governors. Israel could build one for former prime ministers and presidents, because Katzov, the president, Olmert, the prime minister, both served time. Well, Olmert just got out and published a 900-page memoir. I haven't had time to read it all yet. You can only get it on an iPhone here. So that makes 5,000 screens on an iPhone. But Olmert claims that he came closer than anybody ever came. That this actually was closest. He had this map he was giving to Abbas. Let's initial it and we're done. Well, probably wasn't quite that simple. But again, Israel was operating under great time pressure because Olmert was facing these investigations that led to his eventual imprisonment. So he had to resign at the critical moment and nothing happened. And in the next election, Netanyahu won, and of course he's been prime minister ever since. You also have to realize that after 2007, with Hamas in control of Gaza, it's very hard for any Israeli government to sign an agreement with the PA because they know in advance it won't cover Gaza, no matter how dovish the government is. Finally, we come to the last serious peace effort, Kerry's in 2013-14, a valiant effort, just to get the process started. It took great finessing, because the Palestinians refused to negotiate unless there were a freeze on new settlements in the West Bank. He had to finesse that. And then he had to deal with the Palestinian demand of a 9-month limit. This had to be done in 9 months. And anybody who's dealt with international diplomacy knows that that's highly unrealistic. So in April of 2014, when the 9 months are about to expire, Kerry tries to go for a framework agreement. Let's not worry about the details, but get a framework agreement, and he almost reached it. But guess what? Broke down on the same issues as the 2 previous occasions. And at the end of the 9 months, it was the PA who backed off. Hamas, or rather Abbas, announced he was signing 15 UN conventions in his campaign to get international recognition of Palestine as a state. But even more damaging, he was forming a unity government with Hamas, with which Israel, of course, would not negotiate. In any event, that ended the process for them. And it appears that now everybody's waiting for the collapse of Hamas, maybe new governments on both sides. It should be pointed out that in all 3 cases, the time pressure played an important role here. And in all 3 cases, also the Palestinians essentially were backed off at the critical moment. And in the last 2 cases, we're still dealing with the problem of Hamas in control of Gaza. Briefly, just touch on what other options are there. There's a push for a one-state solution in different forms. Now, the one-state solution is simple for the extremists on both sides. It's an all-Jewish state or it's an all-Arab state as far as control is concerned. One side dominates the other. Well, that's not something either side's going to agree to. It's just not workable. So one idea floated was, after all, before 67, we had a stable situation. So return the West Bank to Jordan, return Gaza to Egypt, and problem solved. There's no Palestinian state, but the Palestinians do form part of 2 Arab states. One small problem. The Egyptians are opposed. The Jordanians are opposed. And the Palestinians are opposed. Other than that, brilliant idea. No, the real option that's usually floated here is the idea of a binational state. I'm sure you've heard this. It's hard to argue with the idea. If you have a state in which the 2 sides can share power peacefully, you've solved the problem. You've solved the problem just by setting a framework in which that's required. 30% of Palestinians do support this in recent polls. I take that, though, as a measure of their frustration, not of their belief that this is a workable solution. The track record of binational states is not great. I count two successes. I mean, you really have two nations sharing power in a single state. And that's our neighbor Canada. I can assure you, having presented this in Canada, that not all Canadians agree that it's a success. I understand the Belgians feel the same way. But look at all the failures. And there's no record there of an agreement on sharing power between two parties that are still engaged in violent conflict with each other. If you can't agree on the terms of separation, how can you agree on the minute details of intimate cooperation? For example, I asked this to somebody who really pushes this. All right, what's the immigration policy going to be? Whose right of return do you recognize? Both sides claim a right of return. It's basic to a Jewish state. All Jews have a right to go there. It's equally sacred to the Palestinians that they have a right of return. How do you resolve that? That would make Kansas, Nebraska in the 1850s look like a picnic in comparison. So my bottom line is better a difficult divorce than turbulent cohabitation. I will not try to apply that more generally. So the general trend, if you follow here, it seems to me is very clearly that if you take the long-term perspective, there's been a narrowing of the gap up until the late 1990s, and some regression since then, but it still is a much narrower gap than it was at the outset. There's still a common framework here accepted by a majority on the two sides. And remember that this has only existed for the last 25 years of a conflict that's spread over 135 years. And serious negotiations over basic issues have only taken place for a few months, total, on 3 separate occasions, which we've looked at here. Nevertheless, when we look at those negotiations and the general trends, and despite setbacks, it's possible to see the emerging contours of what a resolution would look like. Clearly, 2 states. There is no other solution. Borders basically the pre-67 lines with land swaps. Jewish Jerusalem as part of Israel, Arab Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state. Palestinian state demilitarized. The Palestinians have more or less come to terms with that. Refugees would be resettled in the Palestinian state or elsewhere. But the most difficult issue remains, one on each side here. Very difficult for the Palestinian refugees to accept this. Very difficult for any Israeli government to accept a resolution that leaves the Temple Mount under the control of the Muslim Waqf. But those are the things that each side is going to have to swallow if there ever is a resolution. So when will this happen? Well, not now, in the near future at least, but there are some grounds for optimism. Initially, neither side saw that there even was another side. It took eventually they were forced to concede the presence of another side, and even though they considered it illegitimate. It took a half-century before compromise was even discussed, and another half-century before the leadership of the two sides recognized each other and accepted a common framework for settlement. So maybe another half-century to work out the details isn't too far out of line. Thank you.
Speaker would entertain a few questions.
Did you do research at the Northwestern, Chicago College? Do you do research for this stuff at Chicago College?
At Northwestern or?
University of Chicago?
Yeah, University of Chicago, yes.
That was a long time ago that I was there, and at that time I was studying American and Russian history.
Was it like, what you guys do with the Russian history? What's it about?
Well, at the time, the Cold War was the focus of most. Remember, this was a long time ago, over 50 years ago.
Thank you.
And the Cold War was what we were focused on at the time, and it seemed to me that studying U.S. history and Russian history would be the key to resolving the Cold War. The Cold War was worked out without me, though, so I went to other things.
Thank you, sir.
Bob?
Wouldn't you agree that the problems that characterize the early history that you so beautifully summarized, where you had the Arab states as a bloc that couldn't accept the idea of a Jewish state or a Jewish presence even, that's really been kind of replaced now by the Hamas, Hezbollah group, perhaps as if not more formidable because of the radicalization involved, and it has also then driven the general Israeli populace into a much more right-wing position that says, if it's taken 50 years or 70 years, it'll take another 50 years. In the meantime, to hell with you. We're going to go on living, and we're not going to worry about it. And so isn't that really a prescription for another long period of not having a solution?
I would agree that certainly that's why I call it the fourth stage of the conflict, that it's changed the basic rules of the game in many ways. That's certainly undeniable. The question is, how long will this movement towards Islamic extremism last? Hamas has never, they won the elections in 2007, but all the Palestinians I talked to said this was a reaction against the corruption of the PA. But they found out that Hamas can be just as corrupt. The recent public opinion polls in Gaza show, in fact, that if there were a free election in Gaza, Hamas would probably lose today. So the trends are not all in one direction here. There's some signs that this wave towards Islamic extremism may be receding. It hasn't achieved them anything. What's happened recently in Gaza is kind of an interesting essay in this. Hamas did not instigate the March of Return and so on. This was apparently a grassroots movement developed without Hamas. They tried to take charge of it. It's a little bit difficult for Hamas, though, to claim leadership of a nonviolent, what's supposed to be a nonviolent movement. And they found themselves working in contradictory ways here. And again, it's not clear that if there were a free election in Gaza, whether they would actually win it. There's a developing opposition to them. Let me just add one footnote to that, and that is that you touched on the way in which the two sides play against each other here. Extremists feed on extremists. They need the extremists on the other side to validate their own position. Israelis on the right will say, well, it's all Hamas, it's all their own. They've never changed it at all, despite what they say, and therefore we can't make any compromise at all. And of course, the extremists, Hamas and other Islamic extremists, use the Israeli extremists as their model. And that validates them. Goldstein, let's not forget some of the things that have carried out on the Israeli side. I have an article that has yet to be written about the role of extremism and how they are allies. They need each other to validate each other in this. Sooner or later, you hope that the moderate middle takes charge on the Palestinian side as well. You know, I'm going on too long, but let me just add one final thought here. Since 2007, the strategy of Israel and of Egypt and of the US and of Europe has been to isolate Hamas in Gaza, blockade it, bring it, keep it, keep humanitarian aid going, you don't want people to starve, but at the same time, bring it to the situation where the Gaza population itself will get rid of Hamas, realizing that Hamas is not achieving them anything. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have worked. These events of the last period show that Hamas has been able, to some extent, to redirect that anger against Israel. So far it hasn't worked. But it was a reasonable strategy to try, and in lack of any other strategy, we'll probably go on, particularly since the Egyptians are cooperating and they're fighting their own battle against ISIS in Sinai and so on. Sorry to go on so long. Yes.
The origins of the refugee problem. 1948, the armies of 6 nations massed, waiting for the stroke of midnight to attack Israel. The question is, and I've heard this mentioned by local Fort Wayne Arab Muslim leaders, that the Jews drove the Palestinians out as opposed to the Palestinians voluntarily leaving, only temporarily, because they were so optimistic that the Arab armies would overwhelm and then they would very quickly return to their homeland. What is the fact separated from fiction? It doesn't make a whole lot of difference in the final analysis.
Okay, I'll recommend the book. It's a book by Benny Morris. In fact, he wrote 2 editions of it, Palestine Refugee Problem and Palestine Refugee Problem Revisited after. And he was the first one who had full access to all of the Israeli military records. Now, what he came up with was what you would call a mixed picture. It depended to a great extent on what phase of the war you were talking about. But he makes it very clear there was no master plan on Israel's part to expel Arabs. In the first part of the war, a large part of the Arab population fled before the war even started. During the war, generally speaking, Arabs fled in advance of the Israeli army. They were afraid. It's normal in warfare. In the last phase of the war, there were several cases in which the Israeli army did expel, particularly around the international airport, Lydda. Been to Israel, Lydda, the airport. They captured the town. They had a lot of troops to hold it. It was right next to the airport. And so they expelled the population. February made the decision. It was done. It's thoroughly documented. And there were a handful of other cases like that in the last phase of the war, when it became clear that the ceasefire lines were going to become de facto borders. So, as I say, I think it's the most honest look at the whole issue. I wouldn't describe it as being totally vindication of Israel, but certainly undercuts many of the claims made about a wholesale eviction. Yes.
I want to thank you for presenting the people of Palestine as well as the people occupying the Israeli lands. The myth of a land without a people and people without a land has to go away. We have to address that. You did very effectively. My question, though, is, have you been to the West Bank or Gaza lately, and the insistence on Israel's part of expansion and acquisition of settlement land and really resources more than just the land? When you say 3% for 3%, if you've got all the aquifers, you've got more than 3%. And what I'm suggesting here is that the settlements are an intentional Israeli policy, and you didn't mention that.
I think the settlements may be a policy of some Israeli governments. I mean, there's partly are aware of vigorous debate on this within Israel itself. And officially, there have been no new settlements since 1992. The settlement population is increased by the natural growth of the existing settlements and by some creative interpretations of something on the next hilltop being part of the first hilltop and so on. I would grant that the settlements are one of the main problems here in any negotiated solution. Now, the idea was that 6% of the territory could be done creatively, would bring 80% of the settlers within Israel, and then again the Palestinians would be compensated with territory elsewhere. I look at the map, I'm a little dubious. I don't see 6% covering 80% of this actual settler population. But the idea, the basic principle of this has been accepted and could prove to be a way out of this. Some people say the settlers could remain as citizens of a Palestinian state. Now, just between us, that's not what they have in mind, and I don't think any of them would actually follow that route. But the polls of Israeli public opinion show that still the vast majority of Israelis would be willing to make that trade. And that only a small minority of the settlers say that they would resist by force if they were evacuated. When they evacuated Gaza in 2005, this was seen by both sides as a kind of test. Can Israel, now we're talking about 8,000 people, not as big a number as exists on the West Bank, of course, but would it be possible to actually evacuate all of the Jewish settlers from Gaza? And it took place within a week, when all was said and done, with the vast support of the Israeli public and a government headed by, of all people, Ariel Sharon, who's blamed for having established many of the settlements in the first place. So there you are. Again, remains one of the most troublesome issues, but there is a framework in which it could be worked out.
We have time for one more question.
In your opinion, if there were a doomsday clock hovering in the Middle East, which way is it going?
I think it's kind of stalled at the moment. I've indicated, I think, where the gap is a lot narrower than most people would be willing to grasp. There's still those two red lines, one on each side, the Temple Mount and refugees. And that still remains a question, but I think we've got a framework. The stars have not all been aligned in the right time and the right place, but it's not out of the thinkable range entirely. That's something will be worked out. But it's stalled. It's stalled. It probably will require new leadership on both sides.
Okay, let's thank our speaker again. And we invite everyone to the back. We have some refreshments. And also in the back on the left side, if you'd like to join our mailing list and get more information about programs, feel free to do so. So thank you for coming this evening.
Fine.